Chapter 1. Save file found. Martin Page had learned that silence came in different varieties. There was the peaceful kind. The kind that settled over a room after a long day when everything that needed doing had already been done. Then there was the lonely kind. The kind that sat beside you on the couch and watched television with you. The kind that followed you into bed. The kind that waited for you when you woke up. At 40 years old, Martin knew the difference intimately. He sat at his desk in the second bedroom of his apartment, staring at several monitors filled with code and system diagnostics. The glow from the screens painted the room in shades of blue and white. Most people would have found the sight depressing. Martin found it comforting. Computers made sense. They either worked or they didn't. If they didn't work, there was a reason. You found the problem. You fixed the problem. Life would have been a lot easier if people had error logs. A notification appeared on his phone. Jacob, be there in 15 minutes. Martin looked at the screen for several seconds before locking the phone. Every other Friday. 2 weekends a month. A schedule. A routine. A court-approved outline of fatherhood. He stood and made his way toward the kitchen. There wasn't any point dwelling on it. There never had been. For 10 years he'd carried the same frustration and learned absolutely nothing from it except that resentment was exhausting. His ex-wife wasn't even the problem. Not really. The marriage had ended because it should have ended. Looking back, he could see it clearly. Two people forcing a shape that didn't fit. She wanted excitement, adventure, social circles, constant activity. Martin liked quiet nights, technical books, and solving problems. He'd spent years trying to become someone else because he loved her. She'd spent years wishing he was somebody different. Neither approach had worked. The divorce had simply been the inevitable conclusion. No screaming, no betrayal, no dramatic argument, just disappointment, followed by paperwork. The knock came exactly on schedule. Jacob. Martin opened the door. His son stood there with a backpack slung over one shoulder and a phone already in hand. 14 years old, tall, awkward, perpetually unimpressed. Martin remembered when he'd been small enough to carry. Now he looked like he might be taller than him by Christmas. Hey, Dad. Hey. Jacob walked inside. Mom said traffic was terrible. Traffic is always terrible. Jacob nodded thoughtfully. Fair. Martin smiled despite himself. The teenager dropped his backpack near the couch before immediately opening his phone again. Martin closed the door behind him. There it was. The familiar ache. Not because Jacob had done anything wrong. He hadn't. He was 14. 14-year-olds lived through their phones. The ache came from realizing how little he knew about his son's daily life. What jokes he liked. What music he listened to. Who his closest friends were. The small details that fathers were supposed to know naturally. You couldn't build 10 years of everyday moments from 4 days a month. Martin had tried. God knew he'd tried. But relationships required repetition. Presence. Shared experiences. All the things that were difficult when someone else controlled most of your access. Still, none of that could be helped. So he focused on what could. Dinner. Jacob looked up. Pizza. I was thinking burgers. Pizza's better. Burgers are healthier. Pizza has tomatoes. Martin stared. Jacob stared back. Finally Martin sighed. You've somehow made an argument that offended both nutritionists and Italians. Jacob laughed. The sound surprised them both. The weekend settled into its familiar rhythm. Dinner. Television. Small conversations. Long pauses. Nothing bad. Nothing particularly memorable. The sort of visit that left Martin wondering if he was succeeding as a father or merely existing near one. Saturday morning arrived quietly. Martin woke early as always. Years of engineering work had permanently adjusted his internal clock. By the time Jacob emerged around 10, Martin was already halfway through a cup of coffee. Morning. Jacob grunted. A stirring speech. Give me 20 minutes. Martin chuckled. The teenager disappeared toward the bathroom. An hour later Jacob had drifted into the second bedroom that served as Martin's office. Martin barely noticed. The room itself wasn't particularly interesting. Bookshelves, hardware components, reference manuals, programming texts, old notebooks, the accumulated debris of a lifetime spent learning. Which was why the shout caught him off guard. Dad. What? Why do you have so many weird books? Martin smiled. That could mean literally anything. He left the living room and walked toward the office. Jacob stood near one of the shelves holding a thick technical textbook. His expression was equal parts confusion and suspicion, like he'd uncovered evidence of a crime. What weird book did you find? Jacob turned the cover toward him. Game engine architecture. Oh, what is this? A book, Dad. A technical book, Dad. Martin folded his arms. You ask very difficult questions. Jacob rolled his eyes. The resemblance to his mother during moments like that was astonishing. What is a game engine? Martin blinked. For a moment the question caught him off guard. Not because it was complicated. Because it was genuine. There was actual curiosity behind it. Not politeness. Not obligation. Curiosity. When you play video games, Martin said, everything that's happening runs on software underneath. That's the game engine. Jacob looked at the book, then at the shelf, then back at him. Why do you have books about making games? Martin frowned. The answer seemed obvious. Because I make games. The silence that followed was immediate. Jacob stared. Dad. Yes. You make video games? A few. You never told me that. Martin shrugged. You never asked. Jacob looked horrified. That's your defense? It has worked for years. That is insane. Martin started laughing. Actually laughing. Not the polite kind. The real kind. Jacob grabbed another book. Then another. Then another. Programming game AI. Dad. Aha. Level design. Still listening. C++ for game development. Jacob looked genuinely betrayed. I thought you did boring computer stuff. Martin put a hand over his heart. That hurts. You fix servers. Among other things. That sounds boring. I enjoy it. You enjoy reading books that look like math attacks. They're entertaining. Jacob raised an eyebrow. No. Martin grinned. Fair. The teenager dropped into a chair. So wait, you actually make games? Mostly as a hobby. Since when? Martin considered the question. 30 years. Jacob blinked twice. What? I started learning programming when I was 10. You've been doing this for 30 years? More or less. That's older than Google. Martin pointed toward the door. Leave my apartment. Jacob laughed. Martin found himself smiling again. The conversation continued. One question led to another. Then another. And another. For the first time in years, Jacob wasn't talking because he felt obligated to maintain the conversation. He genuinely wanted answers. What was the first game you made? A Pong clone. What's Pong? Martin gasped dramatically. Oh no. What? Oh no. Dad. You don't know Pong. I don't think anybody under 60 knows Pong. Martin dropped into the chair across from him. You wound me deeply. Jacob laughed. What happened after Pong? Martin felt something unexpected. Excitement. The same excitement he'd felt discussing the subject as a kid. Nobody ever asked anymore. Most adults didn't care. His coworkers cared about systems architecture. Friends cared about sports. Neighbors cared about property values. Nobody wanted to hear about the evolution of game design over 3 decades. But Jacob did. At least right now. So Martin told him. About learning binary. About discovering memory addresses. About his first successful project. His first failed project. The dozens of terrible ideas he'd abandoned halfway through. Jacob listened. Really listened. Hours passed. Neither noticed. Martin explained ROM and RAM. Processors. Graphics rendering. Artificial intelligence. The endless puzzle solving that had fascinated him since childhood. Finally, Jacob leaned back in his chair. That's actually awesome. Martin froze. What? The game stuff. Oh. I kinda thought programming was boring. Martin smiled. So did your mother. The words escaped before he could stop them. A brief silence followed. Not awkward. Just honest. Jacob glanced at one of the textbooks. Can you teach me? Martin wasn't prepared for how hard the question hit him. Teach me. Not help me. Not explain something. Teach me. A father-sized request. The kind he'd spent years afraid he'd never hear. Martin swallowed. Programming? Jacob nodded. Yeah. For a second Martin couldn't find the words. Then he smiled. A genuine one. Absolutely. Jacob grinned. When do we start? Martin looked around the office. At the books. The computers. The hobby that had quietly accompanied him through most of his life. Then back at his son. Right now. For the first time in a very long time, Martin wasn't thinking about everything he'd lost. He was thinking about what he still had. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. Chapter 2. New character unlocked. Sunday afternoon found Martin sitting across from Jacob at the kitchen table. Laptops occupied most of the available space. A half-empty bag of chips occupied the rest. Jacob stared at his screen with the focused intensity only teenagers could manage when they were simultaneously interested and frustrated. Dad. Yeah. Why isn't it working? Martin looked at the code. Then he looked at the error message. Then back at the code. Then at the error message again. A smile slowly appeared. There it is. There what is? Your first bug. Jacob groaned loudly. I hate programming. You've been doing it for 2 hours. I've seen enough. Martin pointed at the screen. Read the error. I did. Read it again. Jacob frowned. Unexpected semicolon. Martin nodded. Okay. I don't know what that means. You put a semicolon somewhere it shouldn't be. That seems unnecessarily judgmental. Martin laughed. The computer is incapable of being judgmental. It feels judgmental. The computer feels many things. Jacob looked hopeful. Like mercy? No. Compassion? No. Forgiveness? No. Martin pointed at the monitor. The computer feels certainty. You are wrong. Jacob dropped his forehead onto the table. I liked games better before I knew how they worked. That's normal. No, it isn't. It absolutely is. Martin leaned back in his chair. When I was your age, I spent 3 days trying to figure out why a program wouldn't run. What was wrong? A missing bracket. Jacob stared. 3 days. 3 days. That's embarrassing. I agree. The teenager fixed the mistake. A second later, the simple blue square he'd been programming moved across the screen. His eyes widened. It worked. Martin smiled. It worked. I made that move. You did. Jacob sat a little straighter. A tiny accomplishment. A tiny victory. But Martin remembered exactly how it felt. The first time you realized instructions inside your head could become something real. The first time you understood computers weren't magic. They were tools. Powerful tools. That realization changed people. It had certainly changed him. The rest of the afternoon disappeared in much the same way. Questions. Answers. Experiments. Mistakes. More mistakes. The last one especially. Programming involved a remarkable amount of being wrong. By the time Jacob's mother arrived to pick him up, neither of them had realized how late it had become. Jacob closed his laptop. Can I bring this next weekend? Of course. And you'll show me more stuff? Of course. His son hesitated. Only briefly, then picked up his backpack. Thanks, Dad. Simple words. Ordinary words. Yet Martin found himself strangely affected. Anytime. Jacob nodded and headed for the door. A minute later he was gone. The apartment became quiet again. Not immediately lonely, just quiet. Martin sat down at the kitchen table. The second laptop remained open. Lines of code covered the screen. For once, the silence felt different. Lighter. Hopeful. He couldn't fix the past. Couldn't reclaim birthdays he'd missed. Couldn't recover years that belonged to visitation schedules and custody calendars. But maybe there was still time to build something. Not from obligation. Not because he was supposed to. Because they actually enjoyed spending time together. That mattered. A lot. The following weekend arrived faster than expected. Jacob appeared at the apartment carrying both his backpack and a laptop. Did you practice? Martin asked. The grin on Jacob's face provided his answer. I made a thing. Martin narrowed his eyes. A thing. An amazing thing. Should I be afraid? Probably. Jacob immediately opened his laptop. The program on screen consisted of a single square that moved around another square. Nothing particularly impressive. At least not objectively. Martin smiled anyway. That's pretty good. Jacob pointed. It bounces now. Oh, we're reaching advanced technology. It's basically science. Martin chuckled. The next several hours disappeared into programming lessons and increasingly complicated discussions about games. At some point Jacob mentioned a game he had been playing online with friends. Martin happened to know it, which led to a 40-minute debate, which somehow became another hour-long discussion. Conversation flowed naturally, effortlessly. For the first time in years, they weren't searching for things to talk about. The topics arrived on their own. Jacob was explaining a multiplayer system when his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then immediately sat upright. Dad. You need to see this. That statement alone was alarming. Martin looked over. Jacob turned the phone toward him. A local community center announcement filled the screen. Youth Game Development Club, beginners welcome. Martin blinked. Ha! They meet every Saturday. They do. You should take me. Martin looked at the announcement again. Weekly meetings, guest speakers, development projects, local hobbyists. It actually sounded interesting. Maybe. Jacob frowned. What do you mean maybe? I mean maybe. You literally make games. As a hobby. The club is literally about games. Martin folded his arms. Those are compelling points. I know. You prepared them in advance. Maybe. Martin laughed. You absolutely prepared them. Before Jacob could reply, another notification appeared. One he accidentally opened. Conversation. Several messages. One name repeatedly appearing. Sophie. A girl, based on the profile picture. Jacob rapidly grabbed the phone. Too late. Martin's smile widened. Oh, no. Oh, no. Who's Sophie? Nobody. That's suspicious. Jacob looked horrified. Dad. I'm just asking. No, you aren't. Martin leaned back in his chair. Nervous. I'm not nervous. You're very nervous. Jacob pointed accusingly. I got my sarcasm from you. I know. It's your fault. I accept responsibility. The teenager groaned, then immediately changed the subject. The club starts next Saturday. Smooth. Terrible. But smooth. Martin decided not to push further. For now. Saturday morning arrived clear and warm. The community center occupied a renovated brick building near the edge of town. Martin parked and looked up at the banner hanging across the entrance. Dozens of people moved in and out. Children, teenagers, parents, volunteers, the usual crowd for community activities. Jacob climbed out before the engine even stopped. Someone's excited. It's not every day I get to meet people who know what variables are. That sentence confirms you're my son. They entered together. Inside, several long tables were arranged around a large room. Computers occupied some areas. Whiteboards covered others. A low buzz of conversation filled the space. Jacob immediately began looking around. Martin did the same. The group felt more welcoming than he'd expected. Less formal. More relaxed. Before either could settle in, a voice spoke nearby. First time, Martin turned. A woman stood beside one of the tables holding a registration clipboard. Late 30s. Dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail. Warm brown eyes. Comfortable jeans and a green sweater. Pretty. Very pretty. Not that Martin spent much time thinking about such things anymore. Her attention shifted between him and Jacob. You look lost. Martin considered that. We're trying to blend in. You're failing. Jacob immediately nodded. We really are. The woman laughed. A genuinely pleasant laugh. Good to know your son inherited honesty. Martin pointed toward Jacob. He gets that from his mother. Convenient. Very. She offered her hand. Emma Carter. Martin shook it. Martin Page. Nice to meet you. You too. A teenage girl appeared beside Emma. Approximately Jacob's age. Red hair. Freckles. An expression suggesting she'd inherited every ounce of sarcasm available in her family tree. Sophie. Emma said. This is Martin and Jacob. The girl looked at Jacob. Jacob looked at the girl. Recognition crossed both faces simultaneously. Oh. Martin noticed. Emma noticed. Neither said anything. For approximately 3 seconds. Then Emma slowly turned toward him. You saw that too, right? Immediately. The teenagers groaned in perfect synchronization, which only made the adults laugh harder. And for the first time in a very long time, Martin found himself looking forward to next Saturday. Chapter 3. Side Quest. The following Saturday, Martin arrived at the community center 10 minutes early, not because he was eager, because he was responsible. There was an important distinction. At least there was in his head. Unfortunately, Jacob seemed determined to dismantle that argument. You got here early. We got here early. Dad. It was on the way. It isn't. Martin parked the car. Jacob grinned. Emma's going to be here, isn't she? Martin looked over slowly. You're enjoying this far too much. It started last week. What did? The teasing. You started the teasing. Maybe. Martin pointed toward the building. Out. Jacob laughed and climbed from the vehicle. They entered together. The room was already filling with students and volunteers. Several familiar faces waved. Jacob immediately spotted Sophie. The two teenagers exchanged greetings before disappearing toward a table lined with laptops. Martin watched them go. They're becoming friends fast. He turned toward the voice. Emma stood nearby holding a paper cup of coffee. Today her hair was down. Martin immediately hated himself for noticing. Looks that way, he said. Emma followed his gaze. They spend all week messaging. Martin blinked. Really? She sipped her coffee. According to Sophie, they spend hours discussing games. Martin felt absurdly pleased. That was healthier than half the things 14-year-olds could be discussing online. That's good. Emma smiled. Spoken like a parent. Martin laughed. Occupational hazard. Parenting isn't an occupation. Some days it feels harder than engineering. Fair. A volunteer approached carrying a clipboard. Excuse me. Both turned. The volunteer smiled. We need a couple adult supervisors for the beginner project teams. Emma immediately pointed at Martin. Martin immediately pointed at Emma. The volunteer looked between them. Interesting. Sorry, Martin said. Same time, Emma added. The volunteer grinned. Congratulations. You're both volunteering. Martin sighed. Emma laughed. And somehow 10 minutes later they found themselves seated at opposite ends of a long table occupied by 6 teenagers, including Jacob and Sophie. Martin strongly suspected the teens had arranged this somehow. He had absolutely no proof. The suspicious expressions on their faces weren't helping. The instructor stood at the front of the room. Over the next month, each group will create a simple game project. Nothing complicated. The goal is learning. Several teenagers nodded. Others looked terrified. The instructor continued. We'll start with brainstorming. Ideas immediately erupted. Predictably, most of them were terrible. Zombie ninjas. No. Laser dinosaurs. No. Zombie laser dinosaurs. Still no. Martin covered his mouth to hide a smile. Emma wasn't nearly as successful. The laughter escaped before she could stop it. Within minutes, the table had broken into playful arguments. Eventually, after much debate, they settled on a simple adventure game involving treasure hunting. The project was reasonable, achievable. Most importantly, it contained no laser dinosaurs. Progress. As the teenagers began discussing details, Martin and Emma found themselves mostly observing, occasionally answering questions, occasionally preventing catastrophes, mostly listening. So, Emma said quietly, how long have you been programming? Since I was 10. She stared. Seriously? Seriously? That's almost 30 years. Martin winced. When you say it like that, it sounds concerning. It sounds impressive. I'll take impressive. Emma smiled. What got you started? Games. Still. She nodded. I understand that. You do. I'm a fantasy writer. Martin blinked. A professional writer? Emma laughed. Oh, definitely not. Ah. I write because I enjoy it. That sounds familiar. The smile they exchanged held a surprising amount of mutual understanding. Martin recognized it immediately. Passion. Not career. Not obligation. The thing people did because they loved it. The thing they kept doing even when nobody paid attention. Those conversations were rare. Most adults spent their time discussing responsibilities, mortgages, bills, work, schedules, necessary things, important things, but not necessarily the things that made them feel alive. A few minutes later, Sophie called out, Aunt Emma. Yes. How do we make dialogue choices? Emma looked toward Martin. Martin looked toward Emma. Neither answered. Amazing, Sophie said. Jacob nodded. They're both nerds. Absolutely, Sophie agreed. Emma sighed dramatically. We're literally helping your project. That doesn't make it less true. The adults exchanged amused looks. Martin realized something unsettling. He was having fun. Not polite fun. Not responsible adult fun. Actual fun. That realization felt strangely foreign. The following week became one long conversation with Jacob. Primarily because Jacob wouldn't stop texting him. At first Martin assumed something was wrong. The first message arrived Monday evening. Dad, how would inventory systems work in an adventure game? Martin spent 5 minutes crafting a detailed explanation. Jacob replied 20 seconds later. Cool, that was it. Martin stared at the phone. 3 paragraphs. A single word response. Teenagers were emotional terrorists. The pattern continued throughout the week. Questions about programming. Questions about game design. Questions about project ideas. Martin answered every one. Without exception. Each message felt like another thread connecting them. Nothing dramatic. Nothing life-changing. Just regular communication. The sort fathers usually took for granted. Martin certainly didn't. The next Saturday arrived. The project teams gathered again. This time, the teenagers immediately dove into development. Less arguing. More building. Progress. Halfway through the session, Jacob and Sophie approached their table. Both wore expressions that instantly worried Martin. What? Jacob pointed. We need help. That's never good. Sophie nodded. We want dialogue that changes based on player choices. Emma smiled. That's ambitious. We know. Martin folded his arms. How ambitious? The two teenagers exchanged a glance. A dangerous sign. Then Jacob pulled out several pages of notes. Martin stared. So very ambitious. Yes. The next hour disappeared into collaborative problem solving. Ideas bounced across the table. Programming concepts mixed with storytelling suggestions. Everyone contributed. Everyone laughed. Everyone got involved. None of it felt forced. At one point Martin noticed Emma explaining character motivations while he explained branching logic. The concepts were different. The process wasn't. Both were ultimately about creating experiences. Building worlds. Solving puzzles. The realization made him smile. You know, Emma said, noticing. Most people would have told them no. Martin looked up. To what? To all this. She gestured toward the stack of increasingly complicated project plans. They're making the project harder. They're making it better. Emma nodded. Exactly. For a moment neither spoke. Across the room, teenagers laughed. Keyboards clicked. Ideas turned into reality. The atmosphere felt warm. Comfortable. Martin couldn't remember the last time he'd spent a Saturday surrounded by people and genuinely enjoyed himself. Then Emma glanced toward him. You look happier. The observation caught him off guard. What? Than last week. Martin considered denying it. Instead, he surprised himself. Maybe. Emma smiled softly. Good. The simplicity of the answer affected him more than he expected. Not because it was flirtatious, because it felt sincere, like she was genuinely glad. No hidden agenda. No expectations. Just kindness. An increasingly rare thing in adult life. Across the room, Jacob watched the exchange. Then immediately looked at Sophie. Sophie smirked. Jacob smirked back. Neither teenager said a word, which somehow made Martin far more nervous than if they had. Chapter 4. Multiplayer mode. 3 weeks into the game development club, Martin made a discovery. Teenagers were significantly more dangerous when they worked together. Individually, they were manageable. Collectively, they became a coordinated threat. The evidence sat in the passenger seat beside him. Jacob was trying and failing to suppress a grin. You've been staring at me for 10 minutes. I have not. You have. I was thinking. That's usually where trouble starts. Jacob looked offended. Dad. Yes. You make me sound evil. You've earned a reputation. Jacob laughed. The community center had organized a trip to a regional gaming convention one town over. Students would attend workshops, meet independent developers, and see projects from hobbyists and professionals alike. Jacob had been excited for 2 weeks. Martin hadn't expected to enjoy it. Then again, he'd said the same thing about the club. His track record lately wasn't great. As they entered the convention center, Jacob immediately spotted Sophie, which somehow happened despite there being hundreds of people milling around the entrance. Teenagers possessed a supernatural ability to locate specific people in crowds. "See you later." Martin blinked. Jacob was already gone. A red-haired blur joined him. The pair disappeared into the building. "Well, abandoned already?" Martin turned. Emma stood nearby. She carried a convention badge around her neck and looked entertained by the situation. "Less than 30 seconds. She shook her head. "Sophie's getting faster. I don't remember being that eager to leave my parents behind." Emma raised an eyebrow. "You absolutely were." Martin considered it. "You're probably right. I'm definitely right." They entered together. The convention floor stretched across several enormous halls packed with displays, workshops, artists, and exhibitors. Martin's eyes widened despite himself. "Okay." Emma glanced over. "Okay, what?" "This is bigger than I expected." "You sound excited." "I'm gathering data." "That's what excited people call it, yes." Martin sighed. "I'm never going to win these conversations." "Nope." The first hour passed quickly. They visited independent game showcases, watched demonstrations, listened to developers explain design decisions. Martin found himself slipping easily into discussions about programming architecture and gameplay systems. Emma asked questions. Good questions. The kind that made him think. The kind that demonstrated actual interest rather than polite tolerance. That alone felt surprisingly refreshing. At one exhibit, a developer explained an innovative dialogue system. Emma listened carefully. Martin noticed. "What?" She pointed toward the screen. "That's basically interactive storytelling." "It is. So programmers and writers are just solving different versions of the same problem." Martin smiled. "Pretty much." She crossed her arms triumphantly. "I knew it." "Knew what?" "You people secretly care about stories." "You people?" "The coding community." Martin pretended to think. "We'll deny everything. The truth comes out eventually. Traitors exist everywhere." Emma laughed. The sound made him smile before he could stop himself, which was becoming an increasingly frequent issue. The first misunderstanding happened shortly before lunch. Martin and Emma were examining a booth featuring retro game consoles when an older vendor smiled at them. "Nice seeing couples enjoying the hobby together." Martin froze. Emma blinked. "Oh." The vendor nodded knowingly. "My wife and I come every year." Martin opened his mouth. Nothing useful emerged. Beside him, Emma appeared equally surprised. The vendor continued smiling. Neither corrected him, mostly because he immediately turned to another customer. Martin rubbed the back of his neck. "Well." Emma looked amused. "Well." A few seconds passed. Then both started laughing. The situation should have been awkward. Instead it somehow wasn't. Mostly because the assumption felt absurd. At least that was what Martin told himself. The second misunderstanding happened an hour later. This one was significantly worse. The club students were gathering for a group photograph. Volunteers organized everyone into rows. Parents stood behind them. Someone pointed toward an empty space beside Emma. "There you go, sir. Stand with your wife." Martin nearly walked into a chair. Emma physically turned away in a desperate attempt not to laugh. The volunteer continued arranging people. Completely oblivious. Martin leaned closer. "Your fault." "My fault." "You look approachable." "I'm getting blamed for that?" "Absolutely." When Emma finally looked up, she was still trying not to smile. "You realize we could just correct them." "We could." Neither moved. The photographer took the picture. The moment passed. Neither mentioned it again. At least not immediately. The third misunderstanding removed any remaining hope. The students had scattered through various workshops. Martin and Emma found themselves sitting in an audience waiting for a presentation to begin. The seats filled quickly. A woman settled beside Emma. "How long have you two been together?" Martin closed his eyes. Immediately, without hesitation. There was no saving this. The stranger clearly interpreted shared laughter, easy conversation, and spending an entire day together as evidence, which, in hindsight, wasn't unreasonable. Emma glanced toward him. A dangerous sparkle sat in her eyes. Martin recognized it instantly. She was enjoying this, far too much. "We're not, actually." They spoke simultaneously, then stopped. The stranger smiled. "Oh, that's adorable." Martin knew the battle was lost. Emma knew the battle was lost. The stranger definitely knew the battle was lost. The presentation started before further damage could occur. A small mercy. Several hours later, Martin found himself carrying 2 drinks back toward a seating area. He spotted Jacob and Sophie first. Unfortunately, they spotted him too. The expressions on their faces immediately triggered concern. Teenagers smiling together rarely led anywhere good. Martin handed Emma her drink. "Thank you." "You're welcome." Sophie looked between them, then at Jacob, then back. "Oh wow." Martin narrowed his eyes. "No." Jacob grinned. "No what?" "Whatever you're thinking." Neither teenager answered, which somehow confirmed everything. Emma sighed. "They've figured something out." Martin nodded. They think they're subtle. They're really not. Jacob spoke first. So, no. Sophie continued. How was your date? Martin nearly choked on his drink. Emma laughed so hard she had to look away. It wasn't a date, Martin said. The teenagers exchanged a look. An actual look. The kind shared by co-conspirators. Sophie nodded thoughtfully. Of course. Absolutely, Jacob agreed. Martin pointed. You two are insufferable. Thank you, Sophie said. It means a lot, Jacob added. To his horror, Emma high-fived both teenagers. Betrayed by his own side. Outstanding. Later that afternoon, as the convention slowed toward its conclusion, Martin and Emma found themselves walking a little behind the teenagers. Jacob and Sophie moved ahead discussing project ideas. The conversation between the adults settled into a comfortable rhythm. Not forced. Not searching for topics. Comfortable. A realization that seemed to happen more often lately. Emma glanced toward the teenagers. They seem happy. They do. It's nice. Martin nodded. For a moment he watched Jacob laugh at something Sophie said. Genuinely laugh. Openly. The knot he'd carried for years loosened slightly. Not disappeared. Probably never would. But loosened. He smiles more lately. The observation came softly. Martin looked at Emma. He does. She studied him for a moment. So do you. The words landed unexpectedly. Martin looked away toward the convention floor. For once he didn't have a clever reply. Didn't have a joke. Didn't have an escape route. Because she was right. The last few weeks had changed something. Not dramatically. Not magically. Just enough. Enough that he looked forward to weekends again. Enough that conversations felt easier. Enough that life felt slightly less lonely. The silence stretched comfortably between them. Then Emma smiled. You know what the problem is? Martin looked over. What problem? Everyone keeps assuming we're dating. That is technically their problem. She laughed. Fair. A pause. Then, although, Martin waited. Emma met his eyes briefly. At this point I understand why they keep making the mistake. Before he could formulate a response, she walked ahead toward Sophie, leaving Martin standing completely still. For a systems engineer who spent 30 years solving complex technical problems, he found himself facing a fascinating new challenge. He had absolutely no idea what to do with that information. Behind him, a voice whispered dramatically, Dad. Martin turned. Jacob stood there, somehow having materialized out of nowhere. Oh no. Jacob grinned. Oh yes. Martin sighed. It was going to be a very long ride home. Chapter 5. Critical hit. For the next 4 days, Martin Page discovered an unfortunate truth. His son was completely incapable of letting anything go. The first text arrived Monday afternoon. So how long before you ask Emma out? Martin stared at the message. Then he typed a response. Do your homework. The reply appeared almost instantly. That wasn't an answer. Martin put the phone down. 20 seconds later it buzzed again. Interesting that you avoided the question. Teenagers should not be allowed to develop critical thinking skills. It was dangerous. The situation only deteriorated from there. Wednesday evening brought another message. Hypothetically. Martin immediately became suspicious. No, you don't even know the question. I know enough. A pause. Then, hypothetically, if a person enjoyed talking to someone and that person clearly enjoyed talking to them and everyone could see it except them, would that be considered dumb? Martin closed his eyes. Very slowly. Homework. That's not a denial. Martin muted the conversation. It accomplished nothing. Saturday arrived with merciful speed. The game development club met as usual. The students were entering the final phase of their project, which should have occupied all available attention. Unfortunately, Jacob and Sophie had other priorities. Martin recognized the look immediately. The shared glances. The suspicious smiles. The complete inability to behave normally. Emma apparently noticed too. She approached carrying coffee. We're in trouble. Martin nodded. We are. The kids are plotting. They absolutely are. Emma sighed. I knew becoming responsible adults was a mistake. Martin accepted the coffee she handed him. Thank you. You're welcome. For a moment they simply stood together watching the room. Jacob and Sophie sat at their project table discussing game mechanics. At least they appeared to be discussing game mechanics. Martin no longer trusted appearances. Neither apparently did Emma. Sophie has been asking questions. Oh, exactly. Martin smiled. Jacob too. Emma looked amused. Let me guess. He thinks he's subtle. She laughed. Sophie thinks the same thing. The conversation flowed naturally from there. Movies, books, projects, stories from childhood. The usual things. Or at least they should have been usual. Martin couldn't remember the last time talking to someone had felt this effortless. No careful filtering. No pretending interests were different than they actually were. No trying to become someone else. Just honesty. It felt surprisingly rare. As the afternoon continued, an uncomfortable realization settled into the back of his mind. He liked being around Emma. A lot. Not because she was pretty, though she absolutely was. Not because she was kind, though that was equally true. He liked her because being around her felt easy, comfortable, like neither person was performing, just existing, together. The realization should have been obvious. Instead, it was terrifying. The trouble with being 40 years old was that you accumulated experience. The trouble with experience was that sometimes it made you cautious. Martin hadn't gone on a date in years. Not because opportunities never appeared. Because dating seemed exhausting. The apps, the games, the awkward small talk, the endless process of convincing strangers you were worth spending time with. Most of the time, he'd rather stay home and work on a project. It was simpler, safer, no expectations, no disappointment. Yet every time he considered spending time with Emma, none of those objections seemed particularly convincing, which was somehow worse. The following week brought another surprise. A phone call. From Emma. Martin stared at the caller ID, then answered. Hello. Quick question. Okay. How difficult would it be to make branching dialogue save player choices? Martin laughed. Not because of the question. Because she hadn't even bothered with a greeting. What happened? The children had ideas. That's never good. I know. How bad is it? It involves 12 possible conversation paths. Martin nearly dropped the phone. 12. See? That's exactly what I said. For the next 40 minutes, they discussed programming, storytelling, and project scope. It wasn't until the call ended that Martin realized something. The conversation could have been 20 minutes shorter. Maybe 30. Neither of them had seemed interested in ending it. That realization followed him through the rest of the evening. The answer arrived Thursday night. Not from some dramatic revelation. Not from a life-changing moment. Just honesty. Martin sat on his couch after dinner thinking. Something he was admittedly very good at. Perhaps too good. He liked Emma. That wasn't complicated. The complicated part was deciding whether to do anything about it. His thoughts drifted backward. To his marriage. To the slow collapse. To years spent trying to become somebody more interesting. More social. More exciting. Something he had never quite managed. The old wound still existed. Not raw anymore. Just present. His ex-wife had wanted a different life. A different type of man. Nobody's fault. Still, some scars never completely disappeared. A small voice whispered familiar doubts. What if history repeated itself? What if ordinary wasn't enough? What if Martin stopped himself? The questions sounded ridiculous now. Emma already knew who he was. Programmer. Systems engineer. Game nerd. Single father. Quiet. Reliable. Sometimes sarcastic. Occasionally stubborn. Nothing hidden. Nothing exaggerated. No performance. Just him. And she kept showing up anyway. That had to mean something. By midnight, he'd made a decision. Saturday arrived. The game club resumed its usual chaos. Teenagers worked on projects. Adults supervised. Questions flew across the room. The normal rhythm. Martin barely noticed any of it. Because he had spent the entire morning psyching himself up. Unfortunately, decades of debugging software had failed to prepare him for asking someone on a date. Around noon, he finally found an opening. Emma stood near one of the tables reviewing character dialogue. Martin approached. His pulse immediately betrayed him. Fantastic. Hey! She looked up. Hey! For a moment, neither spoke. A systems failure appeared to be occurring. Martin cleared his throat. Can I ask you something? Emma studied him. Her expression immediately shifted. Not nervous. Curious. Of course. Martin took a breath. Then another. This was absurd. He regularly solved technical problems involving thousands of interconnected systems. He shouldn't be intimidated by a conversation. Yet here they were. I was wondering if you'd like to get dinner sometime. The words finally escaped. No teenagers. A smile appeared. No project discussions. The smile grew. No emergency dialogue trees. Emma laughed softly. Dinner. Dinner. An actual date? Martin nodded. If you'd like. For a second, she simply looked at him. Not surprised. Not shocked. Almost relieved. Then she smiled. The kind that reached her eyes. I'd like that. The tension vanished so quickly it nearly left Martin dizzy. Really? Emma raised an eyebrow. You seem surprised. I was preparing for failure. That explains a lot. Martin laughed. The sound came out lighter than he expected. When were you going to ask? She folded her arms. I was giving you time. How generous. I know. How much time? Emma considered. Another week. Martin stared. A week. You seemed nervous. I was nervous. I noticed. Was it that obvious? It wasn't subtle. Martin sighed. Great. It was actually kind of adorable. Martin groaned. Emma laughed. Across the room, two teenagers suddenly looked up from their computers. Jacob saw Martin smiling. Then saw Emma smiling. His eyes widened. Sophie followed his gaze. A second later, both teenagers exchanged a triumphant high five. Martin pointed. See. Emma looked over. Oh no. They know. They absolutely know. The teenagers waved enthusiastically. Neither adult waved back. It didn't matter. The damage was done. Jacob's grin could probably be seen from orbit. For once, however, Martin didn't mind. Because after years of standing still, after years of keeping his head down and simply enduring life as it came, he'd finally done something brave. Not dramatic, not heroic, just honest. And as Emma stepped closer and asked where he wanted to go for dinner, Martin found himself looking forward to next weekend for an entirely different reason. Chapter 6, Boss Fight. Martin spent 23 minutes selecting a restaurant. Then another 17 convincing himself the choice wasn't terrible. Then 10 more wondering if normal people spent this much time worrying about dinner. By the end of the process, he had reached an unavoidable conclusion. Normal people probably didn't. Unfortunately, normal people weren't 40-year-old programmers going on their first real date in years. The restaurant was nice. Not expensive enough to feel formal. Not casual enough to suggest he hadn't thought about it. A careful middle ground. Martin appreciated middle grounds. Life generally happened there. His phone buzzed. Jacob, don't mess it up. Martin stared at the message. Then typed a response. I have made a terrible mistake teaching you technology. The reply arrived instantly. Too late. Martin shook his head. Teenagers. He slipped the phone into his pocket. A few minutes later, Emma walked into the restaurant. Martin immediately stood. Not because he'd planned to. His body simply made the decision before consulting him. Emma smiled. Hi. Hi. She sat down. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Not awkwardly, just differently. The club wasn't here. No teenagers. No projects. No convenient distractions. Just them. Well, Emma said. Well, Martin replied. She laughed. I thought you'd have something prepared. I absolutely did. What happened? I forgot all of it approximately 3 seconds ago. Emma grinned. Good. That makes 2 of us. The admission dissolved the last of the tension. Conversation followed naturally, as it always seemed to. They talked about childhood memories, college, favorite books, old hobbies, terrible fashion decisions from previous decades. Martin discovered Emma had once attempted to learn sword fighting because she'd been reading too many fantasy novels. Emma discovered Martin had built his first computer entirely from secondhand components and accidentally shocked himself twice. Twice. 3 times. She laughed. The number keeps changing. I'm remembering additional mistakes. I believe that. Hours disappeared. Dinner turned into coffee. Coffee turned into a walk through the downtown streets. The autumn air carried the first hints of cooling weather. Storefront lights reflected from windows. A comfortable silence settled between them. Not every pause needed filling. Martin found he liked that. A lot. Eventually Emma glanced over. You know, you seemed surprised when I said yes. Martin sighed. We're really talking about this? Absolutely. I was hoping we'd skip it. No chance. He should have expected that. So he decided to be honest. I haven't done this in a long time. A date. A real one. Emma nodded. I figured. What gave it away? You looked like you were preparing for a technical certification exam. Martin laughed. That's fair. She walked quietly for several moments. Then her expression softened. You know, for somebody who gives off competent adult energy, you're surprisingly unsure of yourself sometimes. The observation landed more heavily than she probably intended. Martin looked ahead. The sidewalk stretched beneath the glow of streetlights. Maybe. Emma studied him. There it is. What? The thing. The thing. The thing you always do when something matters. Martin frowned. I have no idea what you're talking about. I think you do. The frustrating part was that he probably did. Emma waited. Patiently. Without pressure. Without judgment. Just waiting. Finally Martin exhaled. It's stupid. Probably. That's not encouraging. She smiled. It hasn't stopped you before. Martin shook his head. Then looked up at the night sky. I wasn't exactly enough for my marriage. The words emerged quietly. More quietly than he'd intended. Emma didn't interrupt. Didn't rush to reassure him. She simply listened. So he continued. My ex-wife wanted things I couldn't give her. He shrugged. Adventure. Excitement. Whatever word you want. She wasn't wrong. Emma frowned slightly. Martin. I'm serious. I know. He stuffed his hands into his jacket pockets. There wasn't some dramatic ending. No betrayal. No big fight. She just slowly realized I wasn't the life she wanted. A bitter laugh escaped him. Turns out spending evenings building software isn't everyone's dream. Emma stopped walking. Martin took 2 more steps before realizing she wasn't beside him. He turned. She was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen before. Not anger. Not exactly. Something closer to disbelief. You actually believe that? It wasn't a question. Martin hesitated. Believe what? That being quiet is some kind of flaw. He opened his mouth. Emma continued before he could answer. Martin, do you know what I see? This was rapidly becoming uncomfortable. No. I see a man who taught himself programming when he was 10. He blinked. I see a father who spent 10 years showing up even when it hurt. Someone who builds things because he loves building them. Someone who gets excited explaining memory management. She pointed at him. Do you know how rare genuine passion is? Martin stared. Emma folded her arms. Most adults spend half their lives pretending to care about things they don't actually care about. You care. A lot. About everything. He wasn't sure how to respond. Nobody had ever described him that way. At least not recently. Emma's expression softened. I don't need exciting. The words were simple, direct, honest. I need real. For a moment neither spoke. The city continued around them. Cars passed. People laughed somewhere in the distance. The world moved. Yet everything felt strangely still. Martin realized something uncomfortable. The wound he'd been carrying wasn't his ex-wife leaving. Not really. It was the quiet suspicion she'd left behind. The idea that who he was might never be enough. That all the things he loved, the things that made him himself, were somehow lesser. Emma had just dismantled the idea in less than 5 minutes. Not because she'd argued. Because she genuinely meant it. And Martin could tell the difference. You know, he said finally. For a writer, you're surprisingly aggressive. Emma smiled. I'll put that on a business card. The tension broke. Martin laughed. Emma laughed with him. And just like that, the heaviness seemed a little smaller than before. Not gone. Healing rarely worked that way. But smaller. Manageable. Human. They resumed walking. A little closer than before. Neither mentioned it. Neither needed to. 2 days later, Jacob sat at Martin's kitchen table reviewing game code. Something happened. Martin looked up from his coffee. What? Jacob narrowed his eyes. You look different. Martin nearly choked. What does that mean? I don't know. Jacob pointed accusingly. But it's definitely something. Martin considered several possible answers. Ultimately, he settled on the safest one. I'm in a good mood. Jacob immediately grinned. Oh. The smile widened. Martin recognized it instantly. The expression of someone who believed they'd solved a mystery. Which, unfortunately, they had. Jacob leaned back. So how was the date? Martin closed his eyes. Very slowly. Some battles, apparently, were impossible to win. And judging by his son's grin, Jacob knew it too. Chapter 7. Respawn point. The funny thing about being a parent, Martin decided, was that nobody warned you how often success looked like loss. Jacob was 15 minutes late getting out of the car. Not because he'd forgotten something. Not because he was distracted. Because Sophie and 2 other friends were waiting near the entrance to the community center. The moment the car stopped, Jacob was gone. See you inside. The door closed. Martin watched his son jog toward the group. They immediately resumed a conversation that had clearly begun long before he arrived. Laughing, talking, living. For a brief moment, Martin felt something tight twist in his chest. Then he realized what it was. Grief. Not for anything bad. For something ending. The little kid who once needed him for everything was disappearing. The young man who needed him differently was taking his place. The transition wasn't always comfortable. But it was necessary. And far healthier than the alternative. A knock on the passenger window startled him. Emma stood outside smiling. Martin lowered the window. You know they're just going to leave us behind again. Probably. Good. She laughed. You say that now. Had enough teenagers this week. Impossible. Martin climbed from the car. Together they headed inside. The game development club had become a routine for both of them. A good one. The kind of routine people looked forward to. The student projects were nearing completion. Only a few weeks remained before the final showcase. Energy buzzed throughout the room. Excitement, stress, last-minute changes. Martin recognized the signs. Every development project eventually reached the same stage. Panic with a deadline. Jacob and Sophie were seated together reviewing dialogue options. Neither looked up when Martin and Emma approached. Good morning. No response. Emma tried. Hello, children. Nothing. The 2 teenagers continued staring at a laptop. Finally, Martin leaned forward. What are they doing? Arguing, Sophie said. We're discussing. You're arguing. We disagree. Martin nodded. Definitely arguing. Jacob sighed dramatically. We need another opinion. Oh no. Oh yes. Martin exchanged a look with Emma. Neither expected anything good. They were correct. 20 minutes later, they had become unwilling participants in a debate regarding character motivations, branching dialogue, and whether players should be allowed to accidentally insult important story characters. The horrifying answer was that both sides made compelling points. At one stage, Sophie looked at Martin. See. Martin immediately looked at Emma. This is your area. Don't you dare. You're the writer. You're the programmer. The teenagers watched the exchange with identical amusement. Eventually, a compromise emerged. Everyone survived. Progress was made. No friendships ended. A successful meeting overall. At lunch, Jacob surprised him. It happened casually. The way important moments often did. The group sat outside near several picnic tables. Conversation drifted from games to school to upcoming events. A normal afternoon. Then Emma asked a simple question. How's soccer going? Jacob shrugged. Pretty good. Martin blinked. Soccer? Jacob played soccer? The realization must have appeared on his face because Jacob frowned. What? You play soccer? His son's expression instantly transformed. Dad. Oh no. Seriously. Martin raised both hands. In my defense, I've never heard about soccer. You've literally come to games. 1 game. 2 games. Still. Jacob stared at him, then started laughing. Actually laughing. A second later Martin joined him. Because honestly, the situation was ridiculous. After years of worrying about not knowing enough about his son's life, he'd somehow forgotten the most obvious solution. Not because information fixed everything, but because interest mattered. The conversation continued from there. Soccer, school, friends, teachers, weekend plans, normal teenage topics. Nothing extraordinary. Yet Martin found himself learning more about Jacob in 30 minutes than he had in months. Because for once he wasn't trying to force connection. He was simply listening. That evening Martin and Emma walked together after the club ended. The weather had cooled considerably. Leaves drifted across sidewalks. Autumn was arriving. I've been thinking. Martin immediately became suspicious. About parenting. Oh, Emma smiled. Such confidence. I'm usually nervous whenever someone starts with those words. Fair. For several steps neither spoke. Then Emma glanced toward him. You're doing a good job. Martin nearly laughed. You've clearly never watched me attempt to assemble furniture. That's not parenting. No, but it was traumatic. Emma rolled her eyes. I'm serious. The humor faded slightly. Martin looked ahead. I don't know. You do. I missed a lot. The admission came quietly. Honest. Painfully honest. I wasn't there for most of it. Emma considered that, then shook her head. That's not what I see. Martin frowned. What do you see? I see a father who never stopped trying. He didn't answer. She continued. Jacob talks about you differently now. That got his attention. What do you mean? He admires you. The words hit unexpectedly hard. Martin looked away. Across the street, traffic rolled past beneath amber streetlights. He shouldn't. Emma laughed softly. That sounds exactly like something Jacob would say. I mean it. I know. She smiled. Which is probably why he does. For a moment Martin couldn't think of a response. Because admiration wasn't something he'd ever expected. Love maybe. Obligation certainly. But admiration? That was different. That had to be earned. The thought stayed with him for the rest of the walk. The following weekend brought another surprise. Not from Emma. Not from Sophie. From Jacob. The teenager appeared at the apartment carrying his laptop as usual. Working on the project? Martin asked. A little. Jacob sat at the kitchen table, opened the laptop, then hesitated. Dad. Yeah. Can I ask something? Martin immediately put down his coffee. Questions that started that way were important. Of course. Jacob stared at the screen for several seconds. Long enough that Martin knew he was choosing his words carefully. If I wanted to get really good at programming. Martin waited. Where would I start? The question landed somewhere deep in his chest. Because it wasn't really about programming. Not entirely. It was about direction. About identity. About becoming. The kinds of questions young men eventually ask somebody. A teacher. A mentor. Parent. Martin pulled out a chair and sat beside him. You want the honest answer? Jacob nodded. The same place everyone starts. Where? Martin smiled. Being bad at it. Jacob laughed. I'm serious. So am I. He pointed at the screen. You learn. You fail. You learn more. You build things. You break things. Then you fix them. It's not talent. It's time. Jacob listened carefully. The way he always did whenever something genuinely mattered. Martin realized he recognized that look now. He hadn't before. Because he hadn't been around enough. Now he did. And that felt significant. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. Not because programming was complicated. Though it certainly was. Because Jacob wanted to know everything. The same way Martin once had. By the end, both laptops were open. A new project had begun. And for the first time in years, Martin wasn't mourning the child he'd lost to time. He was enjoying the young man his son was becoming. Sometimes growing up didn't cut the ties between people. Sometimes it changed them into something stronger. Something chosen. Something built. Like good code. Like trust. Like family. Chapter 8. Player 2 joined. The morning of the showcase arrived with exactly the level of chaos Martin expected from a development project approaching a deadline. Which was to say entirely too much chaos. His phone buzzed at 7:30. Jacob, we found a bug. Martin smiled. That's development. A response appeared immediately. It's a really bad bug. Define really bad. 30 seconds passed. The dialogue system thinks every player insulted the mayor. Martin laughed. Out loud. Alone in his kitchen. The kind of laugh that would have confused anyone watching. Another message arrived. Even when they didn't. That's unfortunate. Dad. Have you tried not insulting the mayor? There was a long pause. Then, I regret teaching you how texting works. Martin grinned. For the first time in years, the day ahead felt exciting. Not because of the showcase itself, though he was looking forward to it. It was what the event represented. Months ago, Jacob had barely spoken to him beyond polite conversation. Now they texted throughout the week. Shared projects, inside jokes, ideas, life. The change hadn't happened all at once. There had been no breakthrough moment. Just 100 small moments stacked together. Questions, answers, time, effort, connection. The things relationships were built from. The community center looked completely different. Tables filled the room. Projects lined the walls. Parents, volunteers, and visitors moved between displays. Students made final adjustments while pretending not to panic. The pretending wasn't particularly convincing. Martin spotted Jacob immediately. The teenager was standing beside Sophie and gesturing wildly at a laptop. It's still doing it. It isn't. It definitely is. It only happens if they click the wrong dialogue option. Sophie. What? That's all of them. Martin approached. Good morning. Neither teenager answered. Both remained focused on the screen. That's about what I expected. Sophie finally looked up. Tell him I'm right. I'm not doing that. Why? Because I've learned enough about this situation to know somebody loses. Jacob nodded. Smart. Experience. Emma appeared beside them carrying a cup of coffee. How close are we to disaster? Very, Jacob said. Not at all, Sophie said simultaneously. Emma laughed. They've become an actual development team. Martin accepted the coffee she handed him. That's terrifying. Isn't it? The two teenagers resumed arguing. Neither adult intervened. Some lessons needed to be learned through experience, including the universal truth that every project felt doomed 30 minutes before presentation. By early afternoon, the showcase officially began. Visitors moved from table to table trying student projects. Questions filled the room. Excitement gradually replaced anxiety. The game Jacob and Sophie had built proved surprisingly popular. Nothing revolutionary. Nothing commercially significant. Just a charming little adventure game built by teenagers who genuinely cared. Which made all the difference. Martin stood nearby watching people play. Watching Jacob explain mechanics. Watching him answer questions. Watching him talk confidently about systems he'd helped design. Pride settled warmly in his chest. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind. The deep kind. The kind fathers carried. A visitor approached Jacob's table. This is really impressive. Jacob grinned. Thanks. How'd you learn all this? The question seemed simple enough. Martin barely paid attention. Until Jacob answered. My dad taught me. Martin froze. The visitor smiled. Really? Jacob nodded. Yeah. For a second Martin expected the explanation to end there. Instead Jacob kept talking. He started programming when he was 10. The teenager pointed across the room. Toward Martin. He taught me pretty much everything. The visitor glanced over. Martin raised a hand awkwardly. Then immediately regretted it. Jacob wasn't finished. He makes games too. The pride in his son's voice was impossible to miss. Martin felt it like a physical force. Not because of the compliment. Because it wasn't polite. It wasn't obligatory. It was genuine. The visitor smiled. Sounds like you've got a good teacher. Jacob looked toward him. For just a moment. Then nodded. I do. Martin had spent years wondering if he mattered. Years worrying about missed time. Missed moments. Missed opportunities. Standing there, he finally understood something. The time mattered. The loss mattered. But it wasn't the whole story. What mattered even more was what came next. The relationship wasn't frozen. It wasn't finished. It was still growing. Still changing. Still alive. The showcase ended in the early evening. Awards were handed out. Photographs taken. Congratulations exchanged. Jacob and Sophie's project earned recognition for best storytelling. Neither teenager managed to play it cool. The excitement was immediate. Unfiltered. Exactly as it should have been. Hours later the crowd began thinning. Families headed home. Tables disappeared. Volunteers cleaned. The long day finally slowed. Martin found himself outside beneath the fading light of sunset. Emma joined him a minute later. Successful day. I think so. She stood beside him. Comfortable as always. Neither rushed to fill the silence. Inside the building, laughter drifted through open doors. A warm breeze stirred fallen leaves along the sidewalk. Jacob looked happy. Martin smiled. He did. Emma glanced at him. You did too. Maybe. You should stop being surprised when that's true. He chuckled. I'll work on it. For a moment they watched the evening settle around them. Then Martin turned toward her. There was no nervousness this time. No uncertainty. Just honesty. The same thing that had brought them this far. You know, he said. A few months ago I didn't think any of this was going to happen. Emma smiled. The game showcase? Any of it. Understanding softened her expression. Oh, Martin took a breath. Not because he was afraid. Because some moments deserved care. I know where I'd like this relationship to go. Emma met his eyes. So do I. The answer came without hesitation, without doubt, without games. A smile slowly appeared on Martin's face, the kind that felt unfamiliar only because it had been absent for so long. For years he'd focused on what life had taken. The marriage, the time, the ordinary moments of fatherhood he'd never get back. Standing there beside Emma, with Jacob laughing somewhere inside the building, he finally understood that loss wasn't the whole story. Life kept moving. New chapters appeared. Unexpected opportunities, second chances, different paths, not replacements, never replacements. Something new, something worth building. Inside, the community center doors burst open. Jacob and Sophie emerged arguing about sequels. Neither noticed the adults immediately. Their conversation was far too important. Obviously, we need multiplayer. That's a terrible idea. It's an amazing idea. It's your idea. Exactly. Martin laughed. Emma laughed with him. For the first time in a very long time, the future felt less like something to endure and more like something to anticipate. And that, he realized, might be the happiest ending of all. Or perhaps just the beginning. Epilogue. Continue? The hardest thing about being a father, Martin eventually learned, wasn't letting go. It was realizing that letting go had always been part of the job. Jacob's room was empty. Not abandoned. Not forgotten. Just empty. There was a difference. The room sat at the end of the hallway in the house Martin and Emma had bought 4 years earlier. Posters still decorated the walls. A few forgotten items remained on shelves. A box of cables occupied one corner because apparently every programmer inherited the instinct to hoard technology they might need someday. Martin stood in the doorway and smiled. When Jacob was 4 years old, he'd spent nights wondering what kind of man his son would become. Now he knew. Curious, kind, a little stubborn, funny when he wasn't trying to be. The similarities were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The sound of a moving box hitting the floor downstairs pulled him from his thoughts. Dad, Martin sighed. Still alive. Just checking. Some things never changed. He headed downstairs. The living room looked like a temporary storage facility. Suitcases, boxes, bags, more boxes. Enough equipment to suggest Jacob was immigrating rather than attending college. His son emerged from the kitchen carrying another armful of supplies. At 18, Jacob had grown taller than him. Martin found that deeply disrespectful. I thought we packed that already. Jacob shrugged. We forgot it. You said that about 3 other boxes. Those were different boxes. Martin nodded. Excellent distinction. From the couch, Sophie snorted. She'd been helping all morning. Or supervising. The difference remained unclear. The two of them had somehow managed to remain inseparable through all 4 years of high school. Where one went, the other usually appeared shortly afterward. Neither bothered pretending otherwise anymore. Both would be attending the same university in the fall. Both would be majoring in computer science. Neither seemed capable of imagining the future without the other involved somewhere in it. Martin remembered the first day they'd met at the club. 14 years old. Awkward. Sarcastic. Now they were preparing to leave for college. Time was a thief. A remarkably efficient one. You're doing the thing again. Martin looked up. Emma stood in the doorway carrying 2 mugs of coffee. The thing. The staring off into space thing. I was thinking. I know. She handed him a mug. That's the problem. Jacob immediately pointed. See? Mom gets it. Martin rolled his eyes. Traitors. Every one of them. Emma sat beside Sophie. The 4 of them filled the living room with easy conversation. It wasn't something Martin took for granted. Not anymore. Years earlier he had spent too much time mourning lives that never happened. The marriage that failed. The years he missed. The moments he couldn't get back. At some point he and Emma had simply stopped. Not because the past stopped existing. Because they'd realized it didn't deserve control over the future. The past had happened. Ignoring it wasn't healthy. Living inside it wasn't healthy either. So they moved forward. One day at a time. One choice at a time. Eventually those choices became a marriage. Then a house. Then a life. A good one. The best kind, really. An ordinary one filled with people he loved. Later that evening, after Jacob and Sophie left to meet friends, the house finally became quiet. Emma found Martin in their favorite room. The Zen room. The name had started as a joke, then somehow stuck. One half of the room belonged to Emma. Whiteboards covered in planning notes. Story outlines. Character sketches. Research materials. The organized chaos of a writer following inspiration wherever it wandered. The other half looked like a science experiment that had escaped containment. Computers, monitors, electronic components, networking equipment, programming books, technology in various stages of assembly and disassembly. Emma insisted it resembled a mad scientist's laboratory. Martin maintained it was a highly organized workspace. She maintained that was exactly what a mad scientist would say. In the center sat 3 desks. One for Emma, one for Martin, one for Jacob. The third desk was empty now. The laptop gone. The projects packed away. The chair pushed neatly into place. Martin looked at it for several moments. Not sadly, just thoughtfully. Emma settled beside him. You're going to miss him. Of course. She rested her head against his shoulder. So will I. The room fell quiet, comfortable, familiar, the kind of silence that had taken years to build. Martin looked at the empty desk, then beyond it, at the room itself, at the life surrounding it, at the woman sitting beside him, at the future waiting past tomorrow. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. A 14-year-old Jacob holding a programming book. A simple question. What is a game engine? Such a small moment, so insignificant at the time. Yet everything had changed afterward. The desk had started there. Their friendship, their relationship, the game club, Emma, the marriage, the house, the family. Entire futures sometimes grew from moments so small they were invisible when they happened. Life was strange that way. What's going on in that head of yours? Emma asked softly. Martin smiled. I was just thinking. Oh no. He laughed. She looked up. What? Martin glanced again at the empty desk, then at the room around it, then at her. For a lot of years he'd believed his story was mostly finished. Not consciously, just quietly, the way people sometimes do after disappointment. As though life eventually stopped surprising you. As though all the important things happened young. He knew better now. That desk had taught him better. His son's curiosity had taught him better. Emma had taught him better. Life hadn't been finished with him at 40. It hadn't been finished with him at 50 either. If experience had taught him anything, it was that tomorrow had a habit of showing up with ideas no one expected. Nothing, he said. Emma narrowed her eyes. That is absolutely not true. Martin grinned. No, it isn't. She waited. Then what? He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. And for once the answer came easily. I think, he said quietly, I'm looking forward to whatever happens next. Outside, the last light of evening faded beyond the windows. Inside, the future waited patiently. And for the first time in a very long time, Martin welcomed it.